Welcome to NYU. I usually say welcome to the Alliance Française, but no, welcome to NYU tonight. I am the executive director of Alliance Française Washington, D.C., a non-profit organization promoting French language and Francophone cultures. And we are tonight starting our partnership with NYU DC. And for that, I'm very thankful to the university as well as to Tom McIntyre that we met a year ago. And we were happy that President Macron got elected because all of a sudden France came back. First stage in the papers, wow, you know. And there was an interest in producing an event that would allow us, Alliance Française, to talk about France of the future, France the renewed, and in all aspects, because it was quite a surprise for a lot of us, as it was for a lot of us here in Washington, D.C. last November. The Alliance Française offers a wide range of French classes from beginners to advanced levels. So if you want to refresh your French or if you want to start it because you now want to visit the country, please come and see us. We are in Kalorama neighborhood. We have a website, www.francedc.org, where you can also visit our classes. If you have had French before, we will make you take a placement test. It's all free and painless. We have a lovely academic director. And if you think it's something more for your kids or grandkids, we also offer classes for youngsters. And also we have here tonight with us Sandrine Avner, who's the Director of Cultural Programming, without whom the cultural events at the Alliance Française would never happen. And she is assisted by assistant Lisa Grimes. Sandrine is concocting an end of the cultural season that will culminate on June 21st. It's a Wednesday, but it is Fête de la Musique, which is a day when we have the music fest in France. And I invite you to attend this free event on Dupont Circle, weather permitting, because we had a big thunderstorm last year, but we had lovely weather 2 years ago, so we're hoping for the best again. If you want to know more about that event, it's also on our website, and you will see the range and the lineup of musicians that will participate and play for you from about 3 p.m. until 8:30 p.m. on Dupont Circle. I will now introduce our moderator, Joseph Bahout, who will then introduce the speakers that we have tonight. I have known all of them basically, some for more than 8 years, some for less, but I am very happy that we were able to gather all of them today to speak. So Joseph is a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment Middle East program, and his research focuses on the political situation and development in Lebanon and Syria, as well as the identity politics across the region. Before that, he was at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's been also a professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Sciences Po Paris and a senior fellow at the Académie Diplomatique Internationale. He also served as a professor of political sociology and international relations at the Université Saint-Joseph in Beirut and a researcher at the Beirut-based Centre d'études et de recherche sur le Moyen-Orient contemporain. And is currently an associate fellow of the Geneva Center for Security Policy and a member of the scientific board of the Institut Français du Proche-Orient. Without further ado, you got the...
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the Alliance Française for having us. I think it's a very timely and hot subject. I've not been in the US for a long time, but I think that it's quite rare that the French election is so widely covered and so closely followed, which says a lot about the context in Europe and the context of transatlantic relations. In fact, what happened on May 7, the second round of the presidential election, can be, without exaggeration, described as a kind of political coup d'etat. Or call it as you wish, but it was a storm, in fact, that happened in the political landscape of France. You had a very young person, we can't even say a political figure, because his political career was quite meteoric and very short. So Emmanuel Macron, 39 years old, who comes from the fringes of the political club, not from the inside of the political club, has been minister for only 2 years of economy, occupied functions of advisor to the president, but was not from the political club in France, took the system by storm, really. I mean, 2 years ago, I still remember when people were evoking the possibility of a candidacy of Emmanuel Macron, you would have laughs in the audience. People would say, but this is a joke, he cannot do it, he doesn't have a party, he doesn't have a trajectory, the system is too strongly entrenched, it will be quite difficult. So this happened, and what happened also, the other part of the coup d'etat, and probably this is what we will talk about much more, is that the Macron phenomenon was both the product, but also it triggered a kind of very deep reshuffling of the political system in France. You have the two main parties, Socialist Party and the right, which changed names very often the last 2 decades, that used to organize, in fact, the majority of the political life in the country that were completely more than eroded, but almost collapsed. And this is one of the big questions that we will put on the table tonight. Is this collapse underway to be continued? To what extent? What will it mean? And second, in fact, the bet of Emmanuel Macron is to completely take these parts of the collapsing parties and recompose a kind of new political force that will be the organizer probably of the 30 years or more than 30 years to come in France. And this is the second question also, is this bet doable? And more than that, what does it say? What does it tell us about the French institutional construct? Is it the end of a certain form of Fifth Republic, or on the contrary, it is the re-strengthening of the Fifth Republic around a very strong figure of President of the Republic? These are also the structural questions that we have in mind while dealing with the legislative elections. These elections are happening, as you know, probably in 2 rounds. The first round is next Sunday, and the second round is in 2 other Sundays. And so by the end of June, we will for sure have a new political landscape in France. Either a majority, a Macronist majority, that will lay the base for decades of new political life that we don't know much about so far, or Macron, which is not very probable today, will have to coexist with a very scattered National Assembly, a very scattered parliament, in a system that will resemble to the worst days of the Fourth Republic or the worst days of the Italian political system with an ungovernable country. I don't think that this probability is today very strong, but whatever the case, these are the subjects that we will try to shed a light on tonight. And to do so, we have a fantastic set of speakers, a very exciting panel. All of them have, each one from an angle, a very, let's say, rich approach to these questions. And I will give them the floor consecutively. I will start with Philippe Gély, who is in fact now actually the correspondent of the leading French paper, one of the leading French papers, Le Figaro. Okay, he insists to say the leading French paper. I won't quarrel if it's on the internet or paper edition or etc. I don't know. Prior to that, so before coming back, in fact, to Washington, Philippe was heading the international section of Le Figaro in France. Before that, he had a very rich career of international reporter. So he was based in countries that were not always funny to be, like in the Balkans, the Caucasus, Iraq, India, Somalia, and etc. But before that, he was also correspondent in Washington, so he had a previous life in Washington as well. And he also, parallelly to that, had teaching duties at Sciences Po in Paris. After him, I will give the floor to Sonia Dridi, to my left. Sonia is now in Washington covering both international affairs and American political life for mainly for the French TV France 24, but also for other outlets like BFM TV, Europe 1. And also before that, she had a very long and very rich experience in Cairo, based in Egypt, where she in fact covered the early days of the Egyptian revolution. And last but certainly not least, we have Emma Kate Simmons, who also lived for a very long while, on and off, but more or less altogether for 5 years in France, where she was covering French political life, but also European politics for a set of US media and Australian media. After that, Emma came back to Washington, where she is based now, and she is a regular commentator of very prestigious outlets like Reuters, Wall Street Journal, France 24, and BBC World. I will give the floor to each of you for 4 to 6 minutes, just to lay out what you understand of what's happening in France, trying more or less to shed a light on the issues that we have so far put on the table, what to expect from these elections, what will it mean for the Macron presidency, and what would it mean in the longer run for the French institutional construct. Philippe, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, it's hard to follow your steps because you've said it all already. I mean, about the broad picture. It's clear that what's going on in France right now is a fascinating experiment. As such, we don't know how it will end, and there are several factors that can really change radically the picture. Of course, the first of them is the coming parliamentary election. Apparently, according to the polls, it could be that the Republic Onward, or En Marche in French, this party that Emmanuel Macron has created and that did not exist a year ago, could very well have the absolute majority in the French Assembly. The polls give him between 390 and 415 seats among 577. So it's a huge majority. I've even read that Macron could be worried by the size of this majority, because it's not easy to handle such a big majority. And when you have a tight majority, it's much easier to impose some discipline in the ranks. So he seems he's already worried about that. Of course, all the rest of the political spectrum is worried by the fact that we could end up having a sort of unique central party in France, which is amazing, because if you look at the results of the first round of the presidential election, you had such a fractured political scene with 4 main candidates having roughly a quarter of the vote, and 2 of them being extremists, one on the far right, one on the far left, another one conservative, and Macron. And now it's like all this has kind of fusioned in a broad centrist new party, new movement. Everything seems to, I mean, we had here the experience of Donald Trump being, unscathed by any scandal, any problem, and it's almost the same right now in France with Emmanuel Macron. There are some difficulties with a minister who is not exactly following the rules that have been assigned to them in terms of how do you call it, ethics, but still it seems to have no impact whatsoever. He is already, the president is already, this young president is already planning big reforms, the type of which in France, I mean, you would have all the unionized people in the streets in normal times, not this time. So a lot is going on. It seems that the French have decided to give Macron a chance to his kind of soft revolution, if you want. The reason probably is that his first moves have been pretty clever, forming a new government with new faces, but also experienced people in it at the same time. selecting candidates for the parliamentary election. Half of them are from the civil society, but most of them still come from elite, the upper levels, if you want, of this civil society. So I will stop here, but I think the big challenge in the weeks and months to come for Macron will be to reform the country, even to pass some tough reforms, maybe unpopular reform. But the real challenge is for him to govern for the people who haven't voted for him. I mean by that, all the working people who globally have been voting for the extremes on the right and on the left, who are still not convinced by him, although he has his popularity is around 68–70% right now. And so I think the big challenge is for these new elites, if you want, young, globalized, moderate, centrist, European, to manage to show that they can govern also for the good of people, of low-income people and working people. I stop here.
Thank you, Philippe. Sonia, in fact, it's very clear from what Philippe has said that in fact, the renewal of political life is not only about the President of the Republic. Emmanuel Macron is, without any doubt, a very new and very boldly new figure. But if it stops there, this is only cosmetic. This is only the top of the state. But how much this renewal of political elites is at stake now with these legislative elections? Can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, so I think that the election of Emmanuel Macron sent shockwaves in France on the national level, but I think it's going to happen too on the local level. I think it's the first time that I observe so many young people really excited about the legislative elections, which is really not common in France, where people in their 30s, always knew the same, it was always the same people in politics since, 15, 20 years. And it's very fascinating to observe the excitement of a lot of young people in France. For instance, I know, at least 5, 6 girls and boys in their 30s who have been chosen to be the candidate of En Marche for different regions in France. And it's people who have a very diverse background, some coming from les banlieues, like we see in France, from popular areas. Of course, most of them have been in great schools in France, but I think it's the first time, and it's quite historic, that we'll have such a diversity in the candidates for the legislative election. So of course it will be a small percentage, but it's still a renewal on a local level if we manage to have, if these people who have been invested, so chosen to be the En Marche candidate, if they won, because it will be a new generation and who's going to act on a local level everywhere in France. So that's I think that's pretty fascinating to observe. And according to the last poll, I think there was a poll yesterday from IFOP who said that Macron could win between 385 and 415 seats on 577, which will be, it will win in a landslide. And I think it might happen that he will have, such a majority that we didn't see since '68 with the goal. So that's, I think we facing a very interesting renewal. We talk a lot also about Macron mania, but I think it's important to have such a change in France, and I think so many people were waiting for that. And for instance, I was at the French embassy in Washington covering the vote for the legislative election because of logistic reason, French in the US vote a week earlier. And I think, 70-80% of people I talked to after they vote told me they voted because they wanted the Macron's party to have a majority. So, some of them were from the right, some of them were from the left. But, most of the people I talked to, even if the participation was not very high, it was only 20% for the first one in DC for the parliamentary election. But you can see that people really wanted this government to be able to govern. So that even if it's Washington, DC, so it's represent a certain part of the population, but it's still, I think, interesting. And of course, as Philippe said, the challenge will be for the people who don't feel at all represented by this new party, to be able to work with them and convince them, of these changes. And the game totally changed when we see that the PS, Parti Socialist Party, might have only 15-20 seats in the new assembly. It's such an important change in France. So it's going to be very interesting to follow what happened, to see how the youth, in France will indeed be involved in the next few years in politics, if it's going to work and if it's going to last. But yeah, the game definitely changed, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens for this parliamentary election.
Okay. Thank you, Sonia. Emma, in fact, I was saying in the introduction that very rarely a French election, or we can say also a European election, maybe outside Britain and Germany, is so closely followed in the world and mainly in the US. This is probably, it has to do with maybe the figures that were battling. In fact, both Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron are newcomers. They are interesting figures. So there was a personal equation there. But there was also something else. Probably the French election was also closely followed because it marked, or it signaled the halt of a populist trend in the world. It started with the US, with the election of Trump, the Turkish referendum, Brexit, etc., etc. And France was perceived as the first stepping stone where this wave would be stopped. How, as an American, Australian, having lived for a long time in France and Europe, how would you read that? In a comparative lens, how would you read this movement?
Well, I was in France to this election, and I've covered the two previous ones from France, and I have to say it was obviously an international political earthquake from the French perspective, from Europe's perspective, and for Americans, and in fact the global liberal world order. So, I definitely had more interest for what I was writing about than for any previous election, although I must say French elections always get a lot of coverage. But this time, as you say, and as Philippe pointed out, we had these four extraordinarily different characters who were all in the running right until the end of the first round, all running against each other. And really what was so interesting about Macron's victory and watching him actually win over the French people, both from afar and then from sur place when I was actually there, was the fact that he actually went out and argued his case. So rather than retreating like most centre-left and centre-right politicians have done in recent years in the face of the populist threat, he decided to stick to his principles and convictions. And as he said in the documentary on TF1 that was published, that was broadcast just after the election, he said, you have to go to the heart of the beast. You cannot resile from the challenge. And this is something very new. And I wrote a piece for an Australian think tank, and really politicians around the world and political parties have, obviously they started to sit up and listen and look at his approach, and it's really quite unique, and it's something very adapted to the times. So I think what also was interesting for me was that in France, I didn't sense a great deal of joy. On the night of the election, I was there at the Louvre with the 2,500 journalists and went into the crowd. And really there was some joy, but it was mainly a sense of relief. And the French went home early. It was a cold night. And it was really when I came back to the United States that I realized that it was here and around the world. And in Australia, I was getting messages from my friends that people were so excited. And I think it's only now, and I'll be going back to France at the end of the month, particularly since Macron has had this sort of almost faultless early honeymoon period, particularly not just domestically but in the foreign policy sense. I mean, we all know how cleverly he handled Donald Trump, who's managed to really best most of the people opposite him. And now Europe is back, France is back.
Don't mention the handshake, please.
The handshake, I know. Well, you know,
Welcome to that.
Well seen the handshake. But no, I think it's a model for a new politics, and as Sonia pointed out, I mean, when I arrived in France in 2005 as a correspondent for an Australian newspaper, the stories I wrote were about the decline of France. France and Germany were the sick men or women of Europe. There was 11 million huge unemployment in Germany. It was before labour market reforms had really taken their course. And in France, there was high unemployment. There was a lot of pessimism, and there's still some pessimism. But really, this turnaround, which has only taken place in the past year, I mean, even a few months ago, I was writing articles about the decline of the centre, because when Hollande said he wouldn't run, it really looked like, well, you know, what's going to happen? Marine Le Pen appeared like such a threat, and at one point, even during the campaign, she looked like she might get close to winning. There were polls that put her at 41%. But again, Macron came in and he decided to argue the case, and he obviously won the election before, but I mean, the debate, which I'm sure a lot of you saw in French or the English translation, I mean, Marine Le Pen afterwards, it showed that she really lost the election at that point, and perhaps lost it as much as 10 points in some surveys. So therefore, arguing your case and sticking to your principles and being in favour of Europe, an open economy, these ideas are not finished, and in fact, if you sell them in the correct way, people will vote for them. So for me as a journalist, and both as someone who's covered politics and elections around the world, it was a fascinating moment, and it's only really just beginning. So if he gets the majority, if En Marche gets the majority, France is going to change. And I mean, you know, France is not only back, but we could see in a few years the kind of economic turnaround we saw in Germany after the centre left, brought in labour market reforms that really started to, show some impact several years later. And now we look at Germany; it's one of the economic powerhouses of the world. So yeah, I mean, it's an earthquake.
Okay. In fact, let's try to have a look a bit ahead of that. The election now is past us, and we are now talking about the, let's say, the architecture of the new political system in France for decades to come. In fact, Sonia and Philippe, you said that people probably will vote a lot for candidates from En Marche in the coming elections just to give Emmanuel Macron the tools of governance and to give him a chance, as you said, or to allow him to put in place the reforms he wants to put in place. And you, Emma, you said that most of people, you felt that in the Louvre, were more relieved than joyful, in fact, because they voted for him to avoid the worst.
Yes.
Okay, these are on-the-spot factors.
I think it's connected.
After that, I mean, once people will vote to give Macron a majority or to avoid the worst, if the political landscape in France doesn't organize in a structural way for the years and decades to come to translate this into real institutions, new political parties, new political life, new political culture, new political faces, all this will be a kind of nice episode, but we'll forget it.
Or maybe not so nice.
What are the chances you perceive, or what are the potentials for the organization of a new political landscape in the country?
It's a big question mark. I think the two are related. I think there is hope, and there is an almost equal level of anxiety. Mm-hmm. Macron has to succeed. So I think obviously a majority of the voters are ready to give him a majority. But what happens then? You have to realize that, I mean, when some people speak of draining the swamp, we are actually doing that. Mm-hmm. The old parties are all but disappearing right now. And that's part of the movement. I mean, the French look at this young new president, even those who were not really convinced by him. Only 23% of the French electorate was convinced for the first round. Then, of course, in front of Marine Le Pen, it was a totally different story. But even I know a lot of people who were not necessarily enthusiastic about Emmanuel Macron, who thought he was too young, maybe inexperienced, maybe a dreamer. What he was proposing would never happen. Okay, he succeeded. He was very smart in his campaign, in his political strategy. Then his first moves were critical. I think the government he has put around him was a brilliant move. He picked a prime minister on the right, a finance minister on the right, some others from the left. The foreign affairs minister is from the left. New figures, civil society experts, if you want. New discipline, less people, as many women as men. I mean, it was really engaging, interesting to watch as a citizen, as a voter. And I think it plays a big role in the fact that the French people are ready to give him a parliamentary majority. But what happened next? I mean, if he has the majority that the polls are indicating right now, it's also a big problem. I mean, French democracy, just as any democracy in the world, cannot function with a one unique party. It's not the way it works. And we are figuring now a way to drain the swamp, get rid of the old politicians, get rid of the old parties. I mean, you have to see that, to acknowledge that the French Socialist Party is almost the last one in Europe that would keep its socialist name. All the others have changed names in Italy, almost everywhere. So they were like, you know, socialism was really still an important value in French politics. They will get 8% of the vote. I mean, they are out. And we haven't figured yet what will replace them. And I think it's a huge challenge. And we have to find some balance in giving this young president a working majority, and trying to figure out what kind of opposition do we want? Even a constructive opposition, but we have to figure out. And so far, it's hard to see.
I think we could.
Yeah.
I think we could
trust.
Well,
but it's not a new face, right?
You'll have the floor in a second.
Yeah.
Emma, the risky question: what could happen next? I mean, what are the contours of the new political landscape in France? Is Mélenchon the only opponent? Is an opposition between Mélenchon and Marine Le Pen? I mean, two extreme forces at both extreme of the spectrum, and the huge centrist force around Macron. What are the contours of that?
Well, yeah, I think that Mélenchon and Le Pen, who actually appeared to be on the rise and in that, you know, before that first round, and really what happened between the two rounds. And it really was a defeat in many respects for Marine Le Pen, because 33% was not what she was supposed to get. She was supposed to get closer to 40. And now there's ructions within her own party. There's talk about her niece going away and coming back to maybe run the party later. So they've got their own troubles. Mélenchon lost a lot of credibility because he refused to come out and say explicitly that people on the left or anyone should actually vote for Macron to avoid Marine Le Pen. And this was a huge debate and issue in France, and I was there because it was the end of the post-war sort of anti-fascist front, and it was Mélenchon himself who, back when Jean-Marie Le Pen ran in 2002, who had urged socialists to vote for Jacques Chirac. So I think we'll see if Mélenchon gets elected in Marseille. It's possible, and we may also have Marine Le Pen in the north and a few more parliamentarians from the Front National. But I think Macron's large victory has neutralized, in a sense, these two extremist forces, but they're still going to exist. So as you point out, if the reforms that he wants to put in place don't start paying and people don't see a difference in their lives and the same old corruption scandals, which we already have a hint of with his close colleague and something to do with his wife. Okay, it's not the most corrupt thing we've heard of, but seems a bit like the old system. Well, if that continues, he's going to lose credibility. But I'm not sure that's a problem that he's going to have too big majority, because this is a movement. It's not really a political party. And I think what we're going to see, it's going to be how are they even going to really agree? I mean, all those parliamentarians from such diverse backgrounds. Okay, a lot of them actually are socialists from the municipal level. I was reading that, of the half who are actually political, and then there's others who are centre-right, and then there's just people who've never been in politics. So, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting, because it's not going to be like the old party system where, you know, it just comes from on high, or you just get the fracturing. And the left is completely, I mean, demolished. I mean, the centre-left in France, much more, I think, than the centre-right, because, I mean, they're polling half as much as the Les Républicains. And really, I think this is the result. I mean, this is my opinion, but I think this is the result of something that was set in train under François Mitterrand, and the left didn't modernise at the point at which it should have in France, either in the 80s or right up until this day. And so now you have, I mean, I was speaking with a socialist politician today who's in Washington. I won't name him. He's gone back to France. But he was saying, I mean, of course, the socialists are just splitting. There's people who go off and form their own movement, those who are more on the moderate side, and, you know, those who were more like Benoît Hamon, who wanted, you know, more old-fashioned kind of statist economic policies. So, I mean, the risk is more. I mean, how will Macron control that majority? It's true. I don't know how he's going to do that.
But this was exactly my question about. I mean, the political parties themselves. I mean, if we look beyond the elections of next Sunday and Sunday behind it. I mean, the political parties in France are clearly in crisis. This is not only a French phenomenon. It's a phenomenon even Trump's election in the US is the sign of a crisis in the Republican Party. The loss of Hillary Clinton and the rise of Bernie Sanders is a sign of crisis within the Democratic parties. Other parties in the Western world are deeply in crisis. So there is a crisis of political parties in terms of ideology, as you said, and in terms of mode of operation and organization, top to bottom and etc. So there is something new to be invented. Sonia, you alluded to something very interesting, and I think this is one of the angles through which we should maybe read this new political structure. This new appetite from young people who so far were, if not depoliticized, but apolitics. I mean, they were not interested in politics. And now there's an appetite to go and to do things and to participate, maybe in a new form, not in the classical partisan form, but in a new form. First of all, do you perceive this with the people you mentioned? And if yes, what are their prospects for rebuilding political apparatuses, let's not call them parties, that will be the actors of political life? I mean, there's no political life on earth without groupings. Now, call them parties, movement, tribes, whatever, but these are political groupings. So what are these people, these young people, the newcomers to the political scene, what do they have in mind in terms of political organization?
So among the people who have been chosen to be En Marche candidates in France that I know of, I think what's very interesting is that there is a lot of citizens. You know, some are lawyers, some work in an NGO, you know, somewhere in the Socialist Party or in Les Républicains, somewhere already in politics. But many of them really come from the civil society. So I think they maybe have a chance to create a link with the population on a local level, you know, because a lot of people in France are just tired of politics and, you know, feel that when you have the same figures for so long, nothing is going to change. And now even, you know, if in their city, in their region, they see new figures, maybe they'll be, you know, more interested, more willing to be more involved. And to trust more, because there is a huge issue of trust, you know, in France with politicians. A lot of corruption cases since many years. We saw it, you know, on the left, on the right. So that I think that this new generation has a chance, you know, to change a bit the politics and maybe to create a new link with French people. You know, try to, you know, win their trust, and maybe, you know, French people will be more interested in politics. And I think, as you say, this election has been hugely followed on an international level, but I think it's also one of the first time when I see so many people, once again, from very different backgrounds, very interested in what's going to happen next, even in the legislative election that are usually not that followed, and people are not that interested in going to vote for the parliamentary election. But one of the challenges I think we have to talk about too is even within En Marche, some people join also the party by political opportunism, from the right, from the left. So when we're going to talk about the labor law, the tax law, are they going to agree? I mean, how this is going to work? I think I'm very curious to see how it's going to work, because there is really politicians from our spectrum. So I think what's going to happen in the assembly is going to be very interesting, and to see if this movement, that is new and the En Marche will probably have a very large majority in the assembly, how these people are going to agree on very, very important and core subjects.
Yeah, this is, I think, a very important question. There is at least one Mélenchoniste in the room who wants to take the floor, and then probably others after. So I'll open up the questions here. The first hand here is to right. Sarah, do we have a mic or something? Or if not, I think you shouted enough. I mean, we know that we can hear you.
There is a mic here.
Apparently in France, as in many other countries, the media is owned by about five.
Take the mic, it's better. Yeah.
Apparently France, like many other countries, the media is owned by 5 billionaires. To what extent are you tainted by that? Do you have...
I am. I think I'm the only one belonging to a billionaire.
All right.
I work for multiple billionaires. Like.
Lucky you.
I wish I knew a billionaire. But
Was it not true that, in fact, the media is owned by a few billionaires in France? No, it's not.
Depends on what media. We have public TV, which is owned by the state.
Okay, sorry, but what's I mean, can you reach your question?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
all right, well, all right. I want to know if that's a problem, is because your slant is centrist.
Yeah. I understand. You think we all belong to the same
US
group.
Consensus.
Maybe you're right.
The national.
No, but I think the real problem is surely what Macron pointed out in front of Vladimir Putin. The problem is propaganda media like RT and Sputnik, who actually are fake news purveyors, who he banned from being accredited at his events. And I thought that was excellent, because I don't want to be with journalists and then be with non-journalists who are there to actually do something quite opposite to what we're supposed to do, which is report, interpret, analyze, collect facts, interview people. So I don't think it's a problem. They are a problem.
Is it not true that that Mélenchon won more of the youth vote than Macron did?
Nationwide?
He did
In
well.
the first round, yeah, I think it's true.
Did well,
It's
yes.
true.
Maybe yes.
So you're counting on the youth, but without mentioning that Mélenchon won the majority of the youth.
Not the majority.
And Le Pen got a bit.
Qualified.
It's true. She got quite a lot of young people as well.
And we were more also talking about the next step, like one of the subjects of the conference was like the parliamentary election. So now between Macron and Le Pen, what we observe on the ground it's just that there is an excitement from the young people, and that's new. First for politics, and secondly for parliamentary elections. And I think we'll have to see, the participation for the parliamentary election, but I'm sure much more young people will participate in this parliamentary election than the previous one. So, I mean, if we talk, we can talk about, the huge success that had Mélenchon, and it's a fact, of course, but I think if we look forward, that's why we, I think, center on Macron's.
And did you, in fact, say that 24% of the local French population voted? Is that right? 24%?
No, you didn't say that.
No. That's bullshit.
You had a question? There was somewhere. Yeah, please. Here and then here. Okay.
Yes. Thank you. Could you envision a scenario resembling the one that happened in France, happening here in the US in the future, with a two-party system being totally disrupted by the emergence of maybe a more centrist or a party that could unite the right of the Democrats and the leftists from the Republicans? Thank you.
Who would take this one? Emma, go ahead.
I don't think so, sadly, for the United States polity, because if we look at what's happened since the election, there's been virtually no real examination of conscience by the Democrats for why they lost. Hillary Clinton seems to be making a comeback, which is strange because she lost and shouldn't be a candidate again, or at least putting herself forward as such. And the Republicans haven't really, they're not going to impeach Trump anytime soon, and they're basically standing around him. So I don't see any move towards some kind of new movement, breakaway, centrist. I don't know if you can.
No. Comparison between France and the US is really hard to make in any circumstance, I think.
Yeah, but
I mean, politically speaking, you can probably a lot of common points, but in France, I mean, when you have like 11 or 12 candidates on the first round, I mean, the system is so different. I don't see why. I mean, what lacks here in American politics, with regard to with what you mentioned, is some kind of bipartisan work in the Congress, where moderate Republicans could work with moderate Democrats. They don't need to create a third party for that, especially not a centrist party, which would be redundant, I think, here.
Sonia.
I think it's an interesting question, because I think there is an interest. I mean, when we interview people during the presidential campaign, I mean, there is a lot of people, like in France, very tired with politics with both parties. I think the party of the candidate of the third party, I already forgot his name, was not the best candidate. Maybe if he was, did you remember his name? The candidate for the third party for the in the US.
This year?
Yeah.
Gary.
Gary
Thank you very
Johnson,
much.
yeah.
Okay, so he was not the best candidate for a third party, but still he managed to attract an interest. Was interviewed, followed on the social medias. He did a lot of mistakes. For instance, when he made his mistake on Syria, I mean, he was not the best candidate, but there was an interest for a third candidate. So I think, it's first, we never know now what's going to happen in the US. And if you have a really good candidate for a third party in a few years, I think it's something that might happen, because there is definitely an interest. And once again, the new generation is tired of the Republican, the Democrats, either a lot of the same faces or total new candidate.
But Trump is a third-party candidate, isn't he?
Yeah, but he's still Republican. I mean, why not? I think the political structure could at some point change, in the next few years. Maybe not now, but there is an interest.
We have a third question.
So I wish Macron to succeed, but if he doesn't succeed, what do you think will happen in 5 years? Do you think there is a chance for the old parties to come back on the scene?
Interesting question.
Maybe the more extremes, maybe the more extreme of them. It's hard to see. I mean, it's clear that the Socialist Party has to reinvent itself totally, entirely. So maybe rise from the ashes, but it will take some time, and I cannot tell you right now what it will be. On the right, as you said, maybe they are in roughly in a better position to save, the base of the party, although they will lose a lot of seats. I think it's maybe a paradox, but it's more difficult to replace Mélenchon and Le Pen because they stand on a strong ideological position that is in the minority all the time, although Mélenchon on his person was able to rise to almost a quarter of the vote. But when you look at his candidates for the parliamentary election, I mean, they would get, according to the polls, roughly 12%, which is translated in very few seats. So I think from the old system, probably the most extreme parties have a better chance to survive than the moderate ones, because precisely Macron movement is so centrist and try to englobe a lot of moderate people in France.
Emma, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean,
to that?
I think you're right about Marine Le Pen, and the Front National is not going away. They still got 33% of the vote, and that those, disaffected people, not all living on the margins, they're ready to pounce. I think, like, they'll come back in 5 years if they don't see a change in their lives. And I think that Marion Maréchal Le Pen, the niece of Marine Le Pen, thinks of herself as a Macron kind of character. So she's not running for election this time. She's going away to work in Africa. She's going to come back apparently all enlightened, and then I'm sure she will try to take over the party of her aunt, who I'm not sure will leave in a hurry because they're always fighting in their family. But they're definitely not dead. Yes, so 5 years.
Sonia, you want to add something?
I think they've said. I think they've said the main things on the subject. But I think what's worrying now is that because the left and the right are so weak, that indeed the loudest and strongest opposition voice now is the FN. So definitely there is a risk if Macron fails that the FN could come back stronger, even stronger, and we'll need indeed the Socialist Party and the right-wing party to rebuild.
In fact, if I can add my 2 cents on that, I think there's something common in your question and the question of bipartisanship that the predecessor asked. In political science, it's very clear that there's a correlation between the emergence and formation of political forces and the electoral system. I mean, this is an equation that is very well known. So if, like Macron is saying, he will introduce a certain proportion of proportionality in the electoral system, some small parties that are today not very amenable to survive could survive because of the voting system, of the electoral system. So this is a question that you have to see in dynamical terms, not in static. I mean, you can't answer it today if you don't introduce this parameter in the equation.
Thanks. So it was mentioned during the presentation that Macron got 23% in the first round. And then I think, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the woman in the middle, but you mentioned that some of the people after the election were not in France were not necessarily like really excited about Macron, but more just relieved that it wasn't Le Pen. So I was just wondering, it was also mentioned that everyone kind of expects Macron, and maybe I got this wrong, so please correct me if I did, but everyone kind of expects Macron to get his party to get a majority in the parliament. So could you just explain a little bit more why you think that is, given these other facts that I laid out, the fact that he didn't necessarily in the first round have such broad support, and it was more of like a relief that the more extreme didn't get it?
Well, I think it's because he's done such a good job. I mean, he's had a fairly, this is my view, faultless opening start to his presidency. So I know even friends and family who were very skeptical about him between round 1 and round 2, and they got convinced then. And so now we're into a new phase where he's out showing the French, he can be a good president, even though he's 39. He's there on the international stage, really commanding the show at, NATO meetings and, everything in Italy. And so I think that's why, but I think it's also because the other parties are in such a mess. And also he's taken people from both sides, very clever.
And there is always this movement behind the new elected president. I mean, usually,
right.
Yeah.
Even in the old scenario with the standing traditional political parties, there was a boost for the party of the president. But this time it's much bigger.
And it doesn't mean either that the turnout for the parliamentary election will be huge. That's going to be interesting to follow. But because, as you say, a lot of people are were more like a lot of people were just relieved that it was not Le Pen, but these people will not necessarily go vote for the parliamentary election.
Yeah.
But among the people voting, then you'll have, probably a large majority voting for Macron.
Last question here. No, behind you. Yeah. Sorry.
Let me say something. I'm very sorry because we only have 1 hour here, but you will have questions to ask. Please stay afterwards. We have a reception. Wine and cheese, of course, we're French. So to ask the journalist and Joseph as well, and Sonia and everybody afterwards. So do stay behind if you have more questions to ask.
Let me just, at the end, take 2 questions, yours and another one, and then you will have a chance to answer and comment as long as you wish. Please.
Sure. So this time last year, we were talking about the Loi du Travail, and there have been months of the Loi du Travail, the labor laws, and there have been months of protests. Christian Taubira had resigned, and there seemed to be this narrative that reforms weren't going to happen, and now we have a president who basically has built his success around the idea of reforms, and we have this huge electoral success. Can you kind of explain to an outside observer this contradiction or how this has progressed and how that happened?
Okay, and the gentleman here? Yeah.
My question was that we all know that Macron has big plans to reform France, but he also has big plans to reform Europe. I know he wants to really push European integration forward. He wants a European finance minister to administer a European budget. So how successful do you think he'll be on that front? Will he be able to get Germany along with those current sort of plans?
So reforms domestic and reforms European. You have the last word.
I start? On the domestic front, you're right. I mean, there is a paradox, obviously, but maybe it was because as long as politics was played the old way, maybe all the unions and the workers and the civil society was reacting also the old way. I think there is also a dimension, a strategic dimension in how Macron is pushing these reforms, especially the labor market. First of all, he announced ahead of time that would be his first priority and that he would move on this subject right away, even before having the parliamentary election, because they are working on the bill right now, and it's supposed to be adopted in the Council of Ministers on the 28th of June. And as far as I understand that, I think he wants to have the parliament approve a kind of a package of laws that allow him then to rule by ordinance, by decrees, if you want, presidential decrees. So there is also a trick there that may work, but you never know. I mean, maybe in 2 weeks from now or 2 weeks after the election, because now everybody is focused on the election, who will win. I mean, this is the way to express your opinion right now. Go and vote. But maybe a month later, you will have thousands of people in the streets. That may very well happen, or at the fall. Shall I answer also on Europe or no?
I mean, just Sonia, if you want, maybe Emma will take the European side.
Okay, so I mean, I think it's indeed a very sensitive question. I'm not following, as closely the politics in France than here now, but I saw that among the labor law that he might want to take will be one where the companies could renegotiate the contract for the work, and I think that's going to anger a lot of people. So I mean, I don't think we can exclude the fact that we might see some new protests in France at some point. But the flexibility, I think, that you want to bring in the work in the world of the companies and the factories might be more accepted once again, I think, by the new generation who has been used to this flexibility in the monde du travail. And while I think in a lot of unions and maybe the older generation is not going to be happy about that and might protest. So I think the flexibility that he wants to install in the works is going to be a problem on a certain level, and I think that's good. It could be one of the matters that's going to divide the society, and that's going to be very interesting to see the reactions in the next few weeks or months once the decree will be passed.
Oh, okay, just quickly on the Europe question. Well, I think obviously Macron focused on developing a very good relationship with the Germans, with Angela Merkel, while he was campaigning, and that's paid off now. It looks like she will also win. So it'll be the two of them basically running Europe by the fall, again together. But the only thing I would say about that is that, yes, Macron has grand plans for a stronger Europe with more powers, whether it comes to counter-terrorism cooperation or at the financial level, security, borders, these kinds of issues. But the Germans, some of them are concerned that because he has actually, despite the way it's depicted, has some protectionist aspects to his economic policy. Protectionist in a French sense, where he wants to protect and shelter French and European industry. And there's some in Germany who worry about his ideas about handling debt, the euro. So, I mean, I don't think it's all smooth sailing, but compared to the previous French prime ministers, I mean, François Hollande he had issues with Angela Merkel, and Sarkozy certainly did. I mean, it goes back, so I think it's the first time in a long time there's such unity, particularly after Brexit and with Donald Trump. So, I mean, Europe really, I mean, they're benefiting from these two kind of political disasters, if you want to have an opinion, that are actually helping Europe, because they're saying, well, no, we're not going to do that, we're going the other way, and so it seems to be working for the moment.
This is a very good transition for the conclusion. In fact, it pleases us to say that in this week we will witness the first round of French elections, the British election, the UK elections, and then in the summer the German election, and which in fact puts at stake maybe the survivability of Europe if Angela Merkel is weakened. So I think that this subject tonight was, we can't be more timely, and this is really an international context. We could have gone much longer on this discussion, but we have to stop, unfortunately, and I would ask you to join me and thank this wonderful panel. Thank you very much.